V8, 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 V8. Yeah, Furiosa's coming out soon, and I'm pretty excited for that. But it made me remember that I have this little model that I bought a few years ago, and wouldn't it be a great time to paint it? She is Foxtrot from Hasslefree Miniatures, and is totally not Furiosa from Fury Road, then played by Theron of course, and in the new film will be played by Talor-Joy, but this is an older model so it's representing Theron. The sculpt is actually really nice, there's loads of detail, but still with enough space to paint in a variety of styles. Whilst I did grab some reference pictures of both of the Furiosas, Furiosix, I realised quickly that I wouldn't be painting her quite in the same tones as the costumes of the films. But I'll explain that later. What I did notice is there was just a hint of green in Theron's trousers, and so I started with a nice rich green on my model. I realised very quickly that the dark green was actually very rich in its hue, much a greener green than the costumes in the films. And whilst I was happy to have a little bit more saturation, I also took advantage of how the type of paint I'm using works to take the edge off. Acrylic paint like this can be very gloopy, so we mini painters will thin it with water to make sure it goes on smoothly. But when thinned like this, the paint becomes translucent. Often we paint multiple layers to strengthen the colour, but in this case I'm just painting one coat. And that means that the translucent nature of the paint will show the grey primer underneath and subtly let down the strong hue of the green. I did then mix some black paint with my green to make some shadows. Because these models are so small, the light doesn't create shadows in the same way and nowhere near as strongly as it would on a full-size person. But also, they're so small that everything is harder to see, so you have to emphasize everything. This black-green mix is going to be painted on the underneath of all of the folds and in the crevices and creases and the edges of all of the trousers. I also, for the exact same reason, picked out a little bit of highlighting using the original green. By making some areas have two coats, I'll have that strong, richer green tone in the upper sides of the folds where the clothing would naturally catch the light. But I didn't want to push this too far. I moved on to her many belts for the next section. When did many belts become a fashion trend? Anyway, I started painting her many belts with a light brown, slightly more saturated and slightly lighter in tone than the green. But I immediately realised that I wouldn't be able to paint the highlight and shadow in the same way because they're these thin strips rather than a single solid area. But I really wanted to emphasise them because they're so nicely made in the sculpt. Because each belt is so thin, but quite well defined, I was able to trace a very thin line of a darker brown along the edges, which will visually separate them, making them easier to see even on such a small figure. There are even buckles in the sculpts, and these could be quite difficult to paint, but I have a little trick. I'll go over those in kind of the opposite order from how I've painted the leather of the belt. To first paint the darker edges with black paint, and I can go over the whole belt buckle as I haven't painted the main colour yet. I then take the silver, the main colour, and extremely carefully pick out just the bits of each buckle I want to be shiny, leaving the black around the edges to frame them. I also realised at this point that one of the belts has belt loops from the trousers sculpted in. Did I mention this model is very nicely detailed? But I went back with my green paint and I filled in those quickly. Next I'm moving up to her top, which again I want to be lighter in value to the pieces below. But more than that, I want to spend more time on the highlights specifically and less time on the shadows. And for exactly that reason, that same reason as before, to bring the viewer's attention up higher on the model. So a light brown for the base coat that will stay visible as the shadow colour, and the highlight is going to be an ochre. Ochre is a colour that I really love to use. It's like a subtle orangey tan. As I mentioned, I'm trying to emphasise the higher, lighter ochre tones on the upper parts of her top, but trying to keep it even from the left and right, but brightest on any kind of fold that's facing upwards that would catch the light. Now for the part of the model that at the same time is the most important visually, but also the most difficult for me personally to paint: the skin. I have painted literally thousands of models, most of them human and most of those Caucasian or similar, and yet I still can't paint skin very well. You might notice this first layer of paint is a little odd, but as real human skin is somewhat translucent, you can always have a little bit of the red showing from the blood underneath. Even if I'm going to cover most of this up, just a hint of that will give a strong human-like tone to the skin, and this technique does work on darker skin tones as well. But for Furiosa, she's very pale, and so I'm going to highlight this quite a few times. And I'm going to cover almost all of that first layer with the lighter paint. And after a few layers, the important features become very prominent. The nose, the cheeks. I even managed to paint her eyes. They are less than 1mm, and I got them. But there is one specifically important step to do for Furiosa's face. Mixing some dark blue with the skin tone paint, I started the oil marking she puts on her forehead. And here I'm going to highlight? It's kind of a highlight, but in this case for the dark oil I'm using black, which means for the highest points of her forehead, there will actually be the darkest colour paint. And this, similar to many of the other parts of the model, leaves a frame of that blue around the black, making it appear ever so slightly oil-like. Well, that's the plan. That's what I hope to achieve with painting it in this style. With only a few bits left on the model, I'm going to fill in all of the remaining metalwork. Similarly to how I painted the belt buckles before, but her arm and the SKS are much more forgiving as they are larger areas. I left a lot of the arm black, in fact. Even though it looks very shiny, this is because the highest points that should catch the light are where I have painted, and so your eyes naturally see that whole thing as a fully metallic object. The rifle stock also needs a bit of colour, and I started with a very light, almost yellowy sand tan paint, which I instantly wasn't 100% confident about. But I knew that I wanted to be very light in tone at the end, and I could still darken it down with a couple of different techniques that I know. So let's give it a go, and if it doesn't work, I can just repaint it with a richer red type wood. Wood grain in various woods is very dark, often black, rather than being even a dark brown. And so I tried very carefully to freehand on some thin black lines for the wooden gunstock, which was quite difficult and a little messy. Well, I kicked in one of my plans for two benefits. I glazed over some darker brown. Glazing is an extremely thin layer of paint that just tints everything it's going over, darkening the yellow wood and smoothing out the scratchy wood grain. And for me, that made the rifle look just right, and I was happy that I didn't repaint it. There was just one last little thing that was bugging me, although I did go over a few details around the model. Specifically, the pipes on her prosthesis looked like they needed something. Now, I almost went with a blue wiring effect, but instead I thought I'd have a little fun, and so a bright yellow with some black stripes, because what says Wasteland Wanderer better than hazard stripes? And hey, there she is, all painted up and ready for action. As this video goes live, I'm probably out at the cinema right now watching the new film, and probably getting all sorts of ideas for new models, including vehicles that actually do need a better war rate. I'm really happy with how this model looks, far more saturated than the film costumes, because in the films, they have dark characters with rich, vivid backgrounds to give a strong contrast and make the characters stand out. For me, I usually do things the other way around. My backgrounds are quite dull and my characters look bright. If you would like to ask anything about the painting or have anything else to say at all, please feel free to post in the comments section below. Something donation link, something pop back for next week's video, something. I'm ED-SKaR, always will be, and thank you very much for watching.